Welcome to the Sooners 360 Recruiting Podcast. I am doing a special episode today where I have the pleasure of speaking with Greg Glass. Greg is the CEO and co-founder of Fanstake.com, which is basically a new entrepreneurial site related to the entire business of NIL and funding NIL. So it's a kind of a cool new initiative. Greg reached out to me and asked if I could interview him, and I'm very happy to have an opinion on NIL because Greg's very versed in this topic. So we're going to let Greg talk a little bit about what Fanstake is and explain it. And then I'm going to ask Greg some questions about the topic that obviously influences recruiting so much these days, which is NIL. Where are we currently? Greg's very versed in this industry. And I'm probably going to ask Greg if he can perhaps make a little bit of a prediction about where we're going. So this is his logo. It's Fanstake. You can find it by going to fanstake.com. Greg, thanks so much for being on the Sooners 360 Recruiting Podcast.
And great to be here.
And if you could just start off by giving us kind of your elevator pitch on what is Fanstake.
Yeah, absolutely. And we tried to simplify it as much as possible. And so, in short, Fanstake is essentially a competitive fan engagement and recruiting platform. So as an Oklahoma fan, you can go in and say, look, we really want to retain our quarterback material, or maybe we want to retain an offensive lineman or recruit someone out of high school or potentially even in the portal. And you're putting a contingent amount on that player. So you can come in and say, all right, I'm going to put $20 on this player. If the player ends up coming back to Oklahoma, it converts into an endorsement deal between Fanstake and that athlete. And it's funded by the Oklahoma fan base. If, however, they decide that they want to transfer to Texas or Texas Tech, well, you as a fan get 100% of your money back. And so there's no risk as a fan, which is a very different proposition. And so that's the core element of Fanstake, where what we're trying to do is a couple things. One, we want athletes to actually understand what fair market value is. And we'll get into NIL and fair market value in all the congressional action around this. And part of that is creating that dynamic of having a fair market and having it being transparent. But two, what we found is that you need to democratize this a little bit, where fans can have the same influence at a grassroots level that they do if you're, Larry Ellison and you're coming in and you can spend $3 million on a quarterback at Michigan, right? Not every school has that. And so what we found was, look, every school has a passionate fan base that can chip in a small way, especially if it's on a contingent basis. And so we're introducing this new dynamic to the ecosystem. And so far it's off to a great start. And pretty soon, we're going to roll out even more ways where you don't even have to contribute financially. You just have to play for your team, where we can engage all these fans in different ways, and then brands can come in and support the players financially. So lots of different new inventions around this NIL concept.
Okay, so and please correct me for this, but sort of a crowdsourcing GoFundMe kind of approach to NIL and recruiting, a completely legal way through NIL advertising arrangements that you guys will take care of for the players.
Completely legal, and I think it's important to emphasize that too. One of the things that changed back in 2024, there was a Tennessee federal injunction against the NCAA. And basically what they said was, you need to be able to allow these athletes to negotiate in advance of going to a school. And so what Fanstake effectively is a negotiation platform. So the athletes understand, if I decide to go to Oklahoma, there's X dollars. If I go to Texas, there's Y dollars. And that's all Fanstake is. At the end of the day, the player still has to make the decision, and the coaches are making the decision on, are we even going to offer this player? We're just giving the fans the ability to have some influence, because often you feel like you're just on the sidelines and you have no control over that.
Okay, so I'm going to kind of use an example, two current examples, very important to OU fans right now, because from that perspective. So OU obviously played Michigan on Saturday night. One of our OU's offensive line last year in 2024 was kind of a mess. And OU played Michigan the other night against a good defensive line, and the offensive line, five they put out there, did a much better job. And one of the linchpins of that moving forward is Michael Fasusi. He's a five-star offensive tackle that OU signed. He's a true freshman. So obviously one of the concerns OU fans probably have is that Michael starts for OU this year, all the rest of the season hopefully, improves and becomes like a freshman All-American, which I think is not beyond the realm of possibility. He was like the number 2 offensive tackle out of high school. The only guy ranked ahead of him was David Sanders at Tennessee, who's supposed to start for Tennessee, but he's hurt. So he won't be starting in the Georgia game tonight. But so obviously, if you're OU, you're concerned that someone like, I'm not saying they would do this, but I'll just use an example. Someone like Ohio State decides, well, we've missed out on our top 5-star offensive tackle. He went to Tennessee or he chose Michigan or whatever, and our guy's graduating. We've got no one behind him. So, OU fans probably in December are going to be like sweating. If we're in the playoffs, I don't think that's a big a deal because I don't think you would leave then. But we're just sweating that Ohio State, Oregon, someone that OU fans perceive has a bigger NIL budget or a bigger reach than us. Yep. To come in and try and offer him. So how would we start? I'm not saying we're doing this, but just hypothetically, how would we start a retain Michael Fasusi Fanstake platform?
So I want to talk about a couple of things because you bring up so many really interesting points. First off, just to answer that question real quickly, every D1 football player, men's and women's basketball player, they're on the platform already. So you can go to fanstake.com or download the app and put in money. Again, it's contingent, and it's only if he ends up coming back to Oklahoma does it convert. But the bigger thing is really the athlete's perspective on this, because we work with so many different athletes and talk to them. And I try to take their position and try to understand the incentive, right? Like, let's say Ohio State does throw a bag at him and it's a huge number. Well, if he's enjoying the Oklahoma experience and he's getting along with teammates, with the coaching staff, loves the opportunity, what we found is like a lot of these athletes are saying, look, there's a lot of friction to transferring. You don't necessarily want to transfer. It has to be above and beyond what you can get when you stay with your original school, or there's other reasons you're transferring. Often, what's happening is a coach will actually tell these athletes, it's time for you to move on. Like, we don't actually have the room for you, which doesn't get discussed a lot, but that is a frequent occurrence. But assume that this is someone you want to retain. The main thing is it has to be ballpark. And it's similar to any other profession out there where if someone comes to me and makes a huge offer, and I love my job and what I'm doing, but if the money is 4, 5, 6x what I'm making here, well, that's a hard decision, even if I don't want to go do that, because it's a life-changing, family-changing amount of money. And so the way we try to think about this is, look, Fanstake is primarily used more as a retention platform. It's more about how do we keep our core together, especially the folks we know are making an impact. And that's usually where the fans come in, where they have their opinions of what we need and what we're missing. And if you've got a freshman all-star who is they're probably going to get poached, or at least attempted to poach them from other schools, well, there needs to be some level of support that is commensurate with their value. And I think that's what we kind of believe in with the market is, look, Ohio State might peg that value. If you can get close or reasonable, in most cases, the athletes we've talked to are like, it doesn't have to be exactly that. One of the examples, and this is a very different case, but like Montana State, a school that obviously has a lot of pride, but not a Power 4 school. A lot of their players are recruited by Power 4 programs. And they're like, look, I'm getting offered $400,000, $500,000. If Montana State could just give me 100, 150, something reasonable, I would rather be here because I get more playing time. I love the coaching staff. I like the opportunity. I still feel like I can make it to the next level. I'd rather do that than be riding the bench at Ohio State. And so there's all these interesting dynamics that are happening when you talk to the players, you talk to their families. It's about opportunity immediately, but it's also about long-term viability in terms of their career and where it's going to be best for them. And so what we try to promote is, look, can you get the fan bases to support, come out in droves and just make it competitive? And usually not only is it the money, but the athletes see the fans coming at scale. And that's a game changer too, where you're like, wow, like they came out and I really have the support here. And that's meaningful.
Okay, so that makes sense. So that makes sense from a retention standpoint. So part of what I do is I do cover the portal and I cover, OU retaining players, and I completely hear what you're saying, that often players are sort of subtly told you need to move on. Or in a couple of instances with OU recently, a couple of our players, I feel like the coaches were like, look, we just want to be honest. You've fallen behind on the depth chart. You're not going to play here. Let's see if we can find somewhere else for you. So your retention thing makes total sense. But OU, I'm going to give you kind of a concrete example to kind of bring it again out of the abstract, be a little more specific. So OU has a 5-star offensive tackle recruit for the 2027 class. Because right now, for Oklahoma, 2026 is almost complete. So they're almost moving on to 2027 and almost 2028. OU even offered a kid from 2029, which just makes me feel ancient, but we'll get into that. So there's a specific player, which we'll just use an example. He's an offensive tackle from Fort Gibson, Oklahoma. 5-star on the Rivals on 3 conglomerate has him as the number 2 offensive tackle in the country. I think he's top 15 in the country. And he's verbal to Texas Tech right now. He was just at the Michigan game, the Oklahoma game versus Michigan, wearing an OU polo. And OU has most definitely said, we're not giving up in this recruiting. But OU fans are obviously very nervous because Texas Tech and the perceived oil baron money,
right.
They put out a lot of money for Kennedy, the softball pitcher from Stanford, who nearly won the national championship. And the only thing OU fans may be more rabid of, if OU fans are rabid about football, but softball is probably the number 2 sport on campus, just with Patty Gasso, the national championships. She's sort of the goat of softball coaches, and that. So it's right there, but. So obviously they're very cognizant of Texas Tech. So how would I as maybe a recruiting guy say, okay, well, I want to make sure OU has the best opportunity to get Cooper Hackett.
Absolutely. I love getting down to specific use cases. You're right. Texas Tech, I think we all know they've got a ton of money in this new era. They're very well positioned for recruiting. And there's a combination of factors here. Ultimately, when we talk to athletes, money is an important factor. There's also the other elements. You're talking about playing time, coaches, facilities, etc. But look, there's no doubt you're going to have to be competitive in terms of what you could potentially offer. And so where Fanstake comes in there is not only is it the fan base coming on and putting stakes on these particular athletes, but it's also brands that can do this as well. And so it's not just the individual fans. We're also setting up where a brand can come in that traditionally might have been donating, or they're doing maybe NIL deals once an athlete is actually at the program. They could put money on Fanstake as well. And what we end up doing when we do our NIL offers is, let's say there's $50,000 from brand number 1, $100,000 from brand number 2. Well, the NIL deal at the end of the day, we lay out all the details along with the deliverables and the NCAA required quid pro quos for these different brands. And so what the brand is doing in advance is saying, look, if you end up coming to Oklahoma, we believe you're going to give us a great value in terms of the ROI. And that's ultimately what a brand is looking for. And we want your NIL. We're letting you know in advance there's a deal here for you. And that's really what Fanstake is for. So for deals like that, when we're talking about a highly coveted recruit that frankly is probably going to be, high six, low seven figures potentially. When we're getting up in those numbers, especially for certain positions, especially with the quarterback.
He's a left tackle.
Left tackle might not be that high, but then.
But it's not low.
It's not low. It's like we're talking about six figures then, and it's probably high six figures. You're going to need the fans, and you're going to need brands, and some traditional donors, and then Fanstake. Our job is sort of to package all up and really help with the offer. Now, there's going to be rev share, of course, and that's part of it. But what any Power 4 athletic director around the country has already said, rev share now is the new sort of baseline. And the competitive edge is, can you get additional third-party independent NIL opportunities? That's where Fanstake comes in, where our whole goal here is like, let's bring this all together. They're authentic endorsements. It's giving players a sense in advance of what they can look like. And it can make all the difference in the world. And it's hard to know exactly what the package is that Texas Tech might be throwing at them. But from everything I've read, they have the resources to get who they need to get. And so it's going to be a combination of, can you get competitive on dollars, and then sell the rest of Oklahoma? And
right. Sell the SEC.
Exactly.
OU's offensive line coach, Bill Bedenbaugh, has a number of NFL alums that, guys, first round draft picks, you need to just sell the whole package. So that's interesting. When I was speaking to your colleague Steve,
yeah.
And I didn't quite get the marketing brand part, so I'm glad I've had you on the show to talk about it. Now, Greg, obviously you can't be in this space, in this business, without having some viewpoints and some understanding of where we are and maybe where we're going. So, can you give us just sort of 5 minutes, dumbed down for us without legal degrees or legislative law degrees, where you think we currently are, and then after that, could you take us where do you think is because I think one of the problems for college fans is there's no terra firma, right? Every time we think we have something, it evaporates in lawsuits, and now we're like, oh, and then we're back to this.
That's right.
So if you could just give us, quickly in layman's terms, where we currently are, and where do you think where do you think the future stable spot is for us in NIL?
Yeah. I'll give you my 5 minutes, but in 5 minutes this might all change, and so that's kind of how quickly all of this stuff is moving. There's a couple things going on, as everyone's probably familiar with. That the House settlement passed recently, which allows for direct rev share from the universities. And there's also now this the CSC, the College Sports Commission, which has this new entity, NIL Go, that oversees all these deals. And they have some authority in terms of determining whether these deals are at fair market value. Now, they can only do this with collectives that are associated directly with the university. So one of the things that's really unique about Fanstake is that we are free market. We're open for every university and not tied to a particular one. And so the NIL Go and CSC does not have any oversight there. However, now that we have this new world, like I said before, the new competition is on the additional third-party independent NIL endorsement deals. Simultaneously, what's happening is, you'll read the news today, there's this SCORE Act going through the House in Congress. And it is very controversial. And I think the main thing, there are some things that I think we all can agree on, which generally is we want a framework that is consistent, just get everything on rails, that we all understand the rules and we can play within. I think where it's a little bit inconsistent and it's very unlikely to pass the Senate is tied to all the antitrust exclusions that this act is calling for, or a lot of different individuals are looking for. And the reason is, ultimately, the NCAA is still an antitrust violation. It's still the schools colluding amongst themselves to set a salary cap on athletes that aren't employees, nor have they agreed to a salary cap. And so That's very illegal in the United States. Like there's no other industry where you could potentially do that. And so the very year where they finally could start earning some money, right after that, they're trying to clamp down on it. And so it's unlikely, in my opinion, that this will get through the Senate. In the House, you just need a simple majority. And I think with Republicans, it tends to be Republicans are supporting this SCORE Act. There's going to be some bipartisanship in the House, and you'll see some Democrats support it as well. So it will likely make it through. But they need a number of votes from the other side of the aisle when it comes to the Senate. And so it's unlikely any of this will change. And so there's going to be a lot of noise. And so what does that all mean? Well, at the end of the day, I think that the only real solution is some form of collective bargaining. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the athletes have to be employees. I don't think a lot of the athletes want to be employees, but they can still have rights. They can still have the ability to negotiate as a group. And I think the main thing is going to be, look, they're going to ask for things like insurance, healthcare, but also maximum NIL opportunities and allowing the fair market to play out so they can get fair market value. And frankly, like I really do agree with that. I kind of feel like in any market, you need supply, you need demand, you need a willing buyer, willing seller. And over time, there will be an equilibrium. And you're going to find out, all right, did we overpay for that quarterback that we spent $3 million? Maybe. And he's not going to get that next time. And this just takes time to play out. This is the first year, really, that all of this has kind of exploded. And so everyone feels like it's very chaotic because it can be. But what's also happening is you're seeing more parity. You're seeing more people stay in college than actually go to the NFL or NBA draft. And when that happens, those players who are on the bench end up going to other programs because they're not getting the playing time at those big schools. And so you're going to see a better product on the field if you let the market play out. And so that's kind of how we look at this. I think long term, I believe that it is going in that direction. And I think we're going to see more and more opportunities. Obviously, this has been professionalized for a while. The NCAA has never made more money. They're in fine health. You know, the people who are saying that college sports is dying, it couldn't be further from the truth. Like when we look at the deals they're getting, they're making more media revenue, more revenue overall. Ticket sales are through the roof. And frankly, I feel like the sport's in a really good shape. I've been watching a lot of games and I'm having a great time. And so I would caution people to be wary of folks who are saying this is the end of college sports. I actually think it's just the beginning of a new era. It's changing, but it's going to be even better over time.
Okay, well that's a very concise wrap up of it. I'll ask you about the CBA thing because that's it seems to me that the big thing we're moving for was previously sort of in the first. And, from a recruiting perspective, obviously in 2022 is when this sort of all blew up. The 2022 class, Texas A&M seemed to go all in with NIL before anybody really realized. And it was really pay for play. Now that we have the House settlement, we sort of have pay for play decided a little bit. And now it's more of like the real NIL. How do you market? How do you get real advertising? How do you do real advertising? How do you get real brand awareness? How do we establish the market value for the left tackle at Oklahoma versus the left tackle at, say, Vanderbilt? And how do we figure that out? And that seems to be where we're really heading now.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the core elements of Fanstake as well. By being transparent and having an open marketplace, we understand because we have all these fans who are coming in and contributing, who will sign on and say, look, we're fans of Oklahoma. That helps us determine the fair market value of a player because then a brand can come in and say, all right, you've got 50,000 Oklahoma fans. I definitely want to engage with Fanstake to reach those fans because that's where the value is. And they're thinking more about how do I sell my product than how do I do this endorsement deal? Like for them, the end goal is return on investment as a brand. They're trying to get to the fans, not to the athletes. And I think that's one of the more confusing elements of NIL. Everyone talks about what is an athlete getting paid, but for the brands, when you talk to them, they're like, why does this deal make sense for me? Like, am I actually going to
engagement? What's the
exactly? And so in most cases, it doesn't make sense for brands. There's only about 50 athletes a year where they have this huge notoriety in terms of their name, image, and likeness, where you're going to get a positive ROI on that. And so what we're trying to do is get this ecosystem together where we can aggregate all the different athletes. We can aggregate the fans where the real value is. And at the end of the day, give brands the value that they need to get more NIL deals for the programs that are really engaged. And so a bigger long-term vision, but that's a part of it. You're right, where the pay-for-play part is sort of solved with the revenue sharing, but then it's opportunities on top of that. And I think the programs that are more innovative will be very successful on that side of it too.
Okay, because for OU fans, you've gone through I'll just wrap this up. We've gone through a big transition where we've hired a GM for our college football program. It's Jim Nagy, who used to run the Senior Bowl. So he's very, from an NFL perspective,
Right.
He understands salary cap. He understands scouting and evaluation. He understands all he's been doing, because he worked for the Patriots before then, and he's basically hired a staff, combination of NFL types, college types. So OU actually has now a staff, a scouting staff, and a coaching staff. And they basically combine how they're doing recruiting. You know, Jim Nagy basically will take a look at tape. His scouts will look at tape and then send a prospect over to our coaching staff, who will then say, okay, I like that guy. Let's get together. Let's make him an offer. And it's a very new process for me following recruiting, because I'll be tracking recruits, and they're saying, yeah, I met Jim Nagy, and we talked about brand, we talked about value, and it's a very different conversation than that you used to hear the players talking to coaches. They're talking about the program, like our strength and conditioning program. So it's Oklahoma has sort of set up two departments to handle this. So yep. I think they're well set up for the future you're talking about, because, Jim Nagy, knowing how the NFL works, literally basically would scout and evaluate players from around the country, invite them to the Senior Bowl, and basically tell them, look, if you go to the Senior Bowl, you're going to meet all of the NFL scouts will be there. You'll get to, if you're from Montana State and you think you can be an NFL player, you can go to the Senior Bowl. Yes, myriad of examples of that. You can go to the Senior Bowl, compete against the defensive tackle from Alabama, and NFL scouts can see that you can do that. So I think OU set themselves up nicely for kind of the future of what you're talking about.
I agree. That makes perfect sense. And I think, look, the only, edge case to be aware of there is, because revenue sharing is a flat number, the challenge for all of these GMs is, how do you allocate then that rev share amount when you are talking about scouting and recruiting? Because it's not just about football, it's about, again, softball, basketball, all these other programs that you want to be competitive in. And how do you distribute it where it's even? And what we found is that any Power 4 school, everyone's above the cap. Like there's no one that can be both competitive across their suite of sports and stay within it. And so it really is about, and it's not that you're wildly above the cap, but it's usually about $5 to $6 million on average is what we're seeing that they need to come up with in addition to the revenue share amount. And so that's where the GM is struggle, where it's just like, all right, now how do I stay within this? How do we distribute this? Where's the value across the different players, not just within one program, but across all of them?
Well, Greg, thanks so much for being on my podcast. It's kind of a different podcast for me, so I appreciate you taking the time to come talk to me today. I think it's very interesting what you're doing. I probably will try and ask you to come back in 6 months and tell us how things are going, how are things different, and maybe talking about things maybe a little more specific from an OU example possibly. But I appreciate you coming on board, and this podcast will be up on my regular podcast platforms, audio, and will also be up on YouTube within the next 24 hours. So thanks so much, Greg. And
sounds good, Chris. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, if you can have me just a minute, Greg, and then I'll go ahead and end the recording.